Tonight, we begin with a development that local officials, civil rights groups, and federal authorities had feared, debated, and quietly prepared for. A development that unfolded not over months, but in a matter of days. Days that left communities confused. Days that sparked protests outside government buildings. Days that raised a question millions of Americans are now asking. What is ICE doing on America's streets? What federal immigration agents did this week cross a line that many city leaders had hoped would hold, an invisible boundary between federal enforcement and daily civilian life? And when that line blurred, local governments, advocacy groups, and even some law enforcement leaders did not hesitate. They responded with legal challenges, public warnings, and emergency policy meetings. Because this is no longer just an immigration story. It's a story about authority, jurisdiction, and power, playing out in neighborhoods, workplaces, and city streets across America. For months now, there have been signals, not official announcements, not formal policy rollouts, just signals that ICE was preparing something broader and more visible. ICE has always been active, yes, but historically they've been targeted in their activity, focused on specific individuals, specific warrants, specific operations. Their enforcement style followed a certain pattern, a routine, almost a rhythm. But what set off alarm bells in major cities and state governments this year was that the rhythm went quiet. Immigration attorneys noticed fewer routine detainer requests. Advocates noticed fewer court check-in arrests. Local agencies reported less communication. All of that went quiet. And whenever a federal enforcement body goes quiet, experienced observers know something may be about to get loud. Experts who monitor immigration enforcement know the indicators. The shift in field office coordination, the sudden reassignment of enforcement teams, the spike in transportation and detention logistics, and the silence before visible action. Then, suddenly, ICE operations became visible again. But this time, not just at borders, detention centers, or jails. This time, they were on the streets. Early this week, multiple city officials reported what they described as coordinated field operations, including plainclothes agents conducting stops and surveillance in public areas that had not been seen at this scale in years. These are the kinds of visible enforcement moves that ICE typically deploys only when signaling something specific, a surge, a shift in enforcement priorities, or a response to political pressure. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it was all three at once. But what they did know was that ICE was changing posture. And when a federal enforcement agency shifts posture without detailed public explanation, even by a small measure, mayors, governors, and police chiefs pay attention. Because immigration enforcement in the U.S. exists in a complicated legal space. Federal authority, local jurisdictions, constitutional protections. And when those lines start moving in real time, confusion spreads fast. The response issued by several city governments this week was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Local leaders described ICE's increased visibility as unexpected, concerning, and perhaps most importantly, destabilizing to community trust. But enforcement pressure only works if communities freeze. Many didn't. In fact, the reaction was among the fastest coordinated municipal responses we've seen in recent immigration debates. Here's what we know. Within hours of confirmed street-level ICE activity, local officials in multiple cities issued public guidance about residents' rights. These weren't ordinary press releases. These were Know Your Rights campaigns, legal hotlines, and emergency briefings, tools typically deployed when leaders believe fear may spread faster than facts. Immigration advocates confirmed that ICE conducted targeted field operations in neighborhoods, including workplace-adjacent surveillance and residential area arrests that had recently become less common. Agents made arrests before individuals could receive legal warnings from community groups. They focused on individuals with prior removal orders, people flagged through federal databases, locations where ICE believed targets would feel safe. In other words, ICE targeted predictability. The routines people rely on, the daily patterns that make communities feel stable. This is what made local reactions so urgent, because ICE's move wasn't symbolic. It was operational. It represented a kind of enforcement that could reshape daily behavior if left unchecked. And ICE, understanding that visibility changes outcomes, acted with deliberate planning, not randomly, not chaotically, but strategically. They didn't conduct mass sweeps. They didn't deploy uniformed convoys. They used small teams, unmarked vehicles, and rapid detention processing. That precision is what made the operations harder to track and more unsettling for communities watching unfold. And here's where the story becomes even more politically charged. Policy analysts now believe ICE's shift was designed to test the limits of local resistance after years of sanctuary-style policies and court battles over cooperation. ICE wanted to see whether cities would quietly tolerate renewed visibility. But instead, the opposite happened. Local governments didn't stay silent. They issued legal advisories, reinforced non-cooperation policies, and signaled they were ready to challenge federal actions that crossed local legal lines. That response was so public and so coordinated that even federal officials had to address it. You don't get national political attention easily in immigration enforcement. But this week, ICE did. Legal experts described ICE's shift as a form of federal pressure testing, a way to measure how far enforcement could expand without triggering legal backlash. But cities proved they remained both legally prepared and politically vocal. Their response wasn't just loud, it was structured. That matters because it shows local governments are not passive observers. They are active players in the immigration enforcement landscape. AS reports continued coming in throughout the week. We learned more about the scale of activity. Field agents conducted coordinated operations across multiple urban regions, forcing rapid legal mobilization from advocacy networks. Federal teams targeted areas near transit hubs and job sites that had seen little enforcement activity in recent years. Enforcement units operated across city lines, reportedly using mobility to avoid predictable resistance patterns. This wasn't just localized action. This wasn't just routine enforcement. This was multi-city coordination. This was federal posture signaling. And posture signaling is something immigration authorities have struggled to maintain consistently amid shifting administrations and court rulings. For every expansion attempt, local governments have countered with policy shields and lawsuits. Remember, federal officials once believed that interior enforcement visibility would deter migration, that local cooperation would quietly expand, that legal resistance would fade over time. But tonight, the opposite dynamic is unfolding. Local legal resistance is stronger, community awareness is higher, public scrutiny is immediate. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is that ICE's latest moves come at a time when national leaders face pressure from every direction. Some lawmakers want tougher enforcement. Others demand tighter limits on ICE authority. Some governors want cooperation. Some mayors want distance. Federal leadership is balancing these demands while managing court rulings, detention capacity, and international migration pressures. And when agencies in that position make visible moves, they're not doing it from comfort. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from political crosswinds. Federal officials, in statements distributed through national media, signaled that ICE operations were consistent with federal law. They emphasized that enforcement targeted individuals with prior legal orders. That is legal framing language for, we believe we are within our authority. You don't hear that tone unless agencies expect legal and political scrutiny. Meanwhile, several city leaders addressed residents in firm, measured speeches. They said, know your rights. They said, local police are not immigration agents. And they said, we will defend our communities within the law. These aren't slogans. They are statements from governments that understand how quickly fear can destabilize neighborhoods. Here's what adds another layer of concern. ICE's operations weren't happening in isolation. Alongside these actions, legal advocacy groups reported a rise in emergency calls. Community patrols began monitoring neighborhoods. Employers sought legal guidance about workplace enforcement rules, all within the same week. When multiple systems react at once, it means the issue has moved beyond policy into daily life. Analysts now see several possibilities. One is that ICE is preparing sustained visible enforcement. Another is that this is a temporary pressure tactic. A third, the most debated, is that this is a political signal aimed beyond immigration itself. But local governments made one thing clear. They won't respond quietly. They won't respond blindly. They won't respond passively. They will respond through courts, policy, and public communication. What we're watching now is a test of boundaries. ICE wants to assert federal reach. Cities want to assert local limits. Courts want to find constitutional lines. Communities want stability. Officials say monitoring is ongoing. They say legal reviews are underway. And they say ICE's visibility may continue depending on political and legal outcomes. But local leaders are not frozen. They are organized. Their response, legal, public, and coordinated, sent a message to federal authorities that actions will be watched. And it sent a message to residents that information is powered. As the weeks go on, more details will emerge about what ICE hoped to achieve. But what we know tonight is that the response from cities was immediate. It clarified rights. It mobilized resources. And it forced transparency into a fast-moving situation. What happens next depends on what federal authorities do from here. If they scale back, this may be remembered as a warning shot. If they expand, cities have shown they are ready. And tonight, for the first time in months, ICE's next move is uncertain. Federal offices are quiet. Too quiet. And when enforcement agencies go quiet after visible action, it means planning is underway. Because this week, everyone learned something. That immigration enforcement is no longer invisible. That local governments will not stay silent. And that the streets of America have become the newest front line in a long legal and political debate. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The lines are being tested. The limits are being defined. And the country is watching. And we will be here,